Maxime Vachier-Lagrave is the World Blitz Champion, and he did it in dominant style against Jan-Krzysztof Duda in a dramatic Armageddon game to finish. So at the end of all the rounds, we had Firouzja, MVL and Jan-Krzysztof all on 15 points. And the top two of those three, which happened to be Jan-Krzysztof and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, went to a tiebreak game. So they played two tiebreaks, which finished in draws, and then we went to this Armageddon game. So MVL had the white pieces here, Jan-Krzysztof had black, and they trotted out this Spanish line, which they played in the first tiebreak game as it happened. So we had these standard opening moves, and now we had pawn to d3 from MVL, a slightly quieter variation, but lots of flexibility. This bishop got kicked back. Now we had d6, and pawn to a3 here, a good example of the flexibility because this pawn later goes to a4, but first MVL takes a timeout to go a3, giving the bishop a retreat square, not minding the loss of tempo when he does go a4 later. Castles from black, knight to c3. This knight's eyeing that tasty d5 square, and we've not put the pawn on c3, so you have this option. And knight to b8 now from Jan-Krzysztof. He's re-manoeuvring into d7 and freeing up this c pawn later to move forward. Now we had bishop to d2. Might look slightly strange and passive to put it here and not here or here. But the reason this bishop is coming here is that it can often sit quite nicely on c3, sometimes even a5, clamping down against this pawn. So knight b to d7 now, and pawn to a4, starting to attack this pawn chain, a very standard idea. And the pawn kicks on with b4 now. You don't really want to go rook b8 here because after this exchange, white has the a file and this is quite nice. So that's why we had b4 instead. Now the knight jumps in here and we had pawn to a5 defending this pawn which was attacked. If you take here, the problem now is that after bishop takes, rook b8, moving out of that attack, defending the pawn, now white can go a5. And this is a bit of an uncomfortable pawn structure for black with some long-term weaknesses. So that's why we didn't have the capture of the knight on d5 here. And equally, just to briefly point out, you don't really want to go c5 in this position either. Again, this structure is not what you're seeking. And after a simple move like takes, queen takes, white's going to get a lot of play on these light squares here. There's too many weaknesses really, and it's a really nice long-term edge. So that's why pawn to a5. Now we had pawn to c3, immediately undermining that chain. And now we had this capture here, and the bishop recaptured. And now knight to c5, and at this point they're still following the first tiebreak game. So this bishop's attacked, and you don't want to give it up. So that's why we had captures here with check. The bishop recaptured, and now this bishop came to d5, which has just been freed up. The rook's attacked and it comes to a7 here. You'd like to put it on the b file, but the problem is this a5 pawn is a long-term weakness. You could now defend this one from the rook attack, and you're soon threatening to take this pawn here. A nice advantage for white. So that's why we had rook a7, and now we had queen to c2. This is the first deviation from their first game. In that one, MVL went d4 immediately. But here he plays queen to c2, and it's a kind of sneaky trap actually, because Duda plays bishop to g4. Looks nice because this is a critical square. You're attacking one of the pieces which eyes that square, and you're threatening to double the pawns. How is white dealing with that? But here's a great reply from MVL, and if you want to pause it and look for it, please do so. And if you're enjoying this video, then do consider subscribing to never miss a future one. So here MVL played pawn to d4, great move, because now if you capture the bishop, we played this one here. And when the bishop retreats back to g4, now white has lots of nice options. You can play b4 here, even c6 clamping. You're just getting a really nice queenside initiative, and once again this rook and this pawn are all looking a bit dodgy. So that's why coming back here, after pawn to d4, Duda's now forced to take, but after the knight recaptures, this bishop's looking a bit silly now. There's also a threat of a fork here on c6 from the knight, and so that's why it drops back to d7. So a bad loss of time there for Duda. And here we had knight b5, great move, hits this unprotected rook, and best here would have actually been rook to a6, just keeping this bishop on the board, which is a powerful defensive piece, and setting up some play of bringing the rook to the b file here. What Duda might have been afraid of here was this exchange on f6, because after the queen recaptures so as not to have these awful pawns, then you could take here with the knight, but after rook to b6, black is getting some play here. You can block that line with the knight, but then there's a nice shot with knight takes on a4, and after queen recaptures, you're taking this one. You're not going to see all this necessarily in a blitz game, but what Duda could have seen is that he did have this opportunity with rook a6 just to bring it to b6, even if he was chucking a pawn. But we didn't have that. He took that knight, just chopped it off, pawn recaptured, and now we had bishop takes on c3. So the queen recaptured here, pawn to a4 now, and queen to e3. And the big problem for Duda here is this rook is just awful. I mean, the bishop completely cuts it, so it's got no squares here, and the pawn is cutting it here, so it can't actually move. You want to free up this pawn, but then that gets taken. Big problems for black now. So queen to b8, bishop to c6 clamping. Look at the domination of these rooks, and now queen to b6. So Duda's desperately trying to exchange queens with this manoeuvre, alleviate some of the pressure, but it's just not working out. Rook a to d1 now, really nice switch to the centre of the board, because he doesn't mind if these queenside pawns get liquidated. There's a lot going on through the centre now with this e5 break. So rook to b8 here, preparing that queen exchange, but pawn to e5, really powerful. Best would have probably been taking now and then planting the knight on e6, but instead Duda did it in the different order of knight e6 first. It forces this queen exchange pretty much. The rook recaptures, but now you drop a pawn here on d6. We have this recaptures and rook takes. So white is a pawn up and has all the positional advantages as well. Really tough position. a3 seeks to activate that rook. The rook recaptures here, and we had pawn to g3 now, giving the king some space and allowing this one to start moving into the game. Pawn to g6, black does similar. Rook to d7 now, beautiful positioning on the 7th rank, looking at this pawn, and now Duda tries to activate this rook. It was just sat on b6, very, very passive, but it's not much better on b8. And rook to b1 now, really nice move. So there's a threat to start pushing this to b6 now, and that's why we had rook to c3. Now you can't push or you're dropping the bishop. But instead of pushing, MVL now plays a really nice switch with the rook, coming across to the a file, which has just been left by the black rook. And after knight to d8, trying to pick up this bishop, bishop into d5, king f8, we had rook a to a7, completing this harmonious activation of the pieces. Look at these wonderful pieces, completely tying black down. You can't take the pawn here or you lose the knight. This knight can't really go anywhere, and so the rook here is the only piece that Duda can actively move. So he comes to d3. Now we had king to g2, nice move. King to g7. Bishop into c4 now. So he gives this rook exchange, but actually it doesn't make a difference. The pressure's still just way too great with these pieces looking feeble on the back rank here. King to f6, pawn to b6 now, can't be taken because you've got the same issues here. So that's why we had knight into e6, trying to get that knight out of the tactics. But now simply pawn to b7, and after pawn to g5, MVL just traded down into this completely winning endgame. The rook is just so passive and dead here. Pawn to h5 now, king to f3, pawn to f5, pawn to h4, and the king's now going to be breaking in. There's nothing can be done. King to d6 here, rook to h7, pawn takes on h4, pawn recaptures, king to e5, king to e3, rook d8 trying to activate, but now rook takes on h5 because this one's no longer even attacked, so you can leave the defense, and king to d5 was the final move of the game. Here Jan-Krzysztof resigned, it's completely gone. So congratulations to MVL, an amazing achievement for him. If you've enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe and never miss another video, and see the winner of the World Rapid Tournament, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.